David had always been the kind of guy who lived by his calendar. Every Monday morning started with the same coffee from the same shop. Every evening ended with him reviewing blueprints until his eyes burned. He was 32 years old and owned his own architecture firm, something he'd built from absolutely nothing. People respected him. Clients trusted him. But if someone asked him when he last felt truly happy, he wouldn't have an answer. His life was like a perfectly designed building, structured, functional, but somehow missing that spark that makes you actually want to live in it. His sister Rachel kept telling him he needed to get out more, meet people, do something that didn't involve work. He'd always brush her off with some excuse about deadlines or important projects. The truth was, he'd forgotten how to connect with people on any real level. That October evening, Rachel practically forced him to attend an art gallery opening downtown. He complained the whole drive there, saying he had work to finish, that art galleries weren't his thing, that he'd rather be anywhere else. But Rachel wasn't taking no for an answer. She'd been worried about him lately, seeing how he'd become this shadow of the brother she once knew. The gallery was packed with people holding wine glasses and discussing paintings in hushed, sophisticated tones. David felt out of place immediately. He stood near the entrance, checking his watch every few minutes, planning his escape. That's when he saw her across the room. She was standing in front of one of her own photographs, talking animatedly with a small group of people. Her hands moved as she spoke, painting pictures in the air, and there was this energy around her that seemed to pull everything into her orbit. She wore a simple black dress, nothing fancy, but something about the way she carried herself made her impossible to ignore. David found himself staring, which wasn't like him at all. Then, as if she felt his gaze, she looked directly at him. Their eyes met, and for a moment everything else in that crowded gallery seemed to fade into background noise. She smiled, not in a polite way, but like she'd just discovered something interesting. Before he could look away or pretend he'd been staring at something else, she was walking toward him. His heart started beating faster, which felt ridiculous. He was a grown man, a successful professional, and here he was feeling like a nervous teenager. "You look like someone who doesn't want to be here," she said, stopping right in front of him. Her voice was warm, slightly teasing. David laughed nervously. "That obvious?" "Only to someone who's paying attention," she replied. "I'm Isabella. These are my photographs on the walls, in case you were wondering." He introduced himself, and they shook hands. Her grip was firm, confident. She asked him what he did, and when he mentioned architecture, her whole face lit up. She started talking about how photography and architecture were connected, both about capturing space and emotion, about how buildings could tell stories just like photographs. David found himself actually engaged in the conversation, not just being polite. Isabella had this way of asking questions that made him think, that challenged his carefully constructed views on things. She asked him why he became an architect, and instead of giving his usual professional answer about design and creativity, he found himself telling her the truth, that he'd wanted to build things that lasted, that mattered, because so much in his childhood had felt temporary. The gallery started emptying out, but they kept talking. Rachel found him at some point, gave him a knowing look, and whispered that she'd catch an Uber home. He barely noticed. Isabella suggested they continue their conversation over coffee, even though it was already past 11 at night. They found a small diner that stayed open late, the kind with worn red booths and fluorescent lights that buzzed slightly. They ordered coffee that was probably terrible, but neither of them cared. Isabella told him about her photography, how she approached strangers and asked to photograph them in moments of vulnerability, right after a breakup, during a personal victory, in times of grief. She said people's faces told stories their words never could. David talked about his work, but also about things he rarely discussed with anyone. How he'd spent the last 3 years building his business, but somehow felt emptier than when he started. How success was supposed to feel different than this. How he sometimes wondered if he'd traded his life for a career. Isabella listened in a way people rarely did anymore, without checking her phone, without waiting for her turn to talk, just really listening. She told him she understood that feeling, that she'd spent years chasing something she thought would make her happy, only to realize she was running away from herself. The diner staff started giving them looks, the kind that said they wanted to close up. David checked his phone and was shocked to see it was almost 3 in the morning. He couldn't remember the last time he'd stayed up this late just talking to someone. As they walked to their cars, Isabella turned to him. "This was really nice. I don't usually connect with people this way." "Me neither," David admitted. "Actually, I can't remember the last time I connected with anyone at all." She gave him her number, written on a napkin from the diner because she said she liked doing things the old-fashioned way. As David drove home that night, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. Not for a project deadline or a client meeting, but for the possibility of seeing someone again. He barely slept that night. His mind kept replaying their conversation, the way she laughed, how she'd looked at him like she was really seeing him, not just the successful architect exterior he showed the world. For the first time in 3 years, work wasn't the first thing on his mind when he woke up. The next morning, he texted her. Just something simple about enjoying their conversation. She responded within minutes, and they started texting throughout the day. Her messages were different from anyone else's. Thoughtful, funny, sometimes just observations about the world around her. By the end of that first week, they'd met up 3 more times. Each meeting felt like peeling back another layer, discovering more about each other and, strangely, about themselves. Isabella had this way of making him question things he'd always accepted as truth, of making him see his own life from different angles. David didn't realize it yet, but that rainy October night had started something that would completely transform him. Isabella had walked into his carefully ordered world like a storm, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The next few months felt like David was living in a completely different world. Before Isabella, his days had been predictable, almost mechanical. Now every day brought something unexpected. She'd call him at random times, asking if he could leave work early to catch the sunset from some viewpoint she'd discovered. She'd show up at his office with takeout food and insist they have lunch on the roof of his building instead of at his desk like he usually did. Isabella didn't just enter his life, she rearranged it. And the strange thing was, David let her. He started saying no to evening work sessions, something he'd never done before. His business partner noticed the change, even commented that David seemed happier, more relaxed. His sister Rachel was thrilled, saying this was exactly what he needed. Their connection went beyond anything David had experienced before. When they were together, conversation flowed effortlessly. They could talk about serious topics like childhood trauma and personal fears, then switch to laughing about something ridiculous like bad movies or weird food combinations. Isabella had this gift for making everything feel significant and lighthearted at the same time. The physical attraction between them was intense from the start. Every touch felt electric, charged with something David couldn't quite name. Holding her hand sent shivers through him. When she'd run her fingers through his hair while they watched movies on his couch, his whole body would come alive. He'd never been the type to prioritize physical affection, had always been somewhat reserved in that way. But with Isabella, he craved her closeness constantly. She introduced him to her world, a world of art openings, poetry readings in small cafes, late-night drives to nowhere in particular. They'd park somewhere with a view and just sit in his car, talking until morning. She taught him how to see beauty in ordinary moments, how a random Tuesday afternoon could be just as special as a planned Saturday night. David found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. He started carrying his phone everywhere, something he'd previously been disciplined about avoiding during work hours. Now he'd check it constantly, hoping for a message from her. When her name appeared on his screen, his heart would jump. When hours passed without hearing from her, he'd feel this strange anxiety he couldn't quite shake. His friends noticed the change too. When they'd ask him to hang out, he'd check first to see if Isabella was free. If she was available, he'd make excuses to his friends. He didn't see it as choosing her over them. It just felt natural to prioritize time with her. She made him feel things his friends couldn't, made ordinary moments feel extraordinary. Isabella had this spontaneous nature that both excited and sometimes frustrated him. She'd decide at 10 p.m. that they should drive 3 hours to the beach to see the sunrise. Initially, David would hesitate, thinking about his morning meetings, his responsibilities. But she'd look at him with those eyes full of life and possibility, and he'd find himself grabbing his keys. Those spontaneous adventures became his favorite memories, watching the sunrise over the ocean, both of them exhausted and covered in sand, sharing a thermos of coffee, exploring abandoned buildings she wanted to photograph, him pointing out architectural details while she captured them through her lens. dancing in his living room at 2 a.m. to songs from her playlist, her laugh filling every corner of his apartment. But it wasn't just the exciting moments. Isabella also shared her struggles with him. She told him about her battles with depression, how some days she'd wake up feeling like the world was gray and heavy. She explained how she'd learned to manage it, but that it never fully went away. David admired her honesty, her vulnerability. He promised he'd be there for her through the hard days, not just the good ones. What he didn't realize was how much he was beginning to need her. His happiness had become dependent on her presence. Good news at work didn't feel complete until he'd shared it with her. Bad days only felt bearable if he knew he'd see her that evening. He'd started measuring his life in terms of time with Isabella versus time without her. His work started suffering in small ways at first. He'd be in client meetings but thinking about something funny Isabella had said that morning. He'd stay up too late with her and drag through the next day on too little sleep. Projects that used to excite him felt like obstacles keeping him from her. Rachel expressed some concern one afternoon when they met for lunch. She said she was happy he'd found someone but worried he was losing himself in the relationship. David brushed it off, saying she was overthinking things, that he was just happy for the first time in years. But deep down, somewhere he didn't want to look, he knew she might be right. The truth was, Isabella had become his entire world. She was his first thought when he woke up and his last thought before sleep. She'd gone from being someone who added to his life to being the center of it. And while it felt amazing, intoxicating, like the best high he'd ever experienced, there was also something slightly terrifying about it. He'd catch himself sometimes, in quiet moments alone, feeling almost panicked at the thought of losing her. What would he do without her laugh, her touch, her way of making everything feel alive? He'd become addicted to the feeling she gave him, that sense of being truly awake for the first time. Isabella seemed to feel it too, this intense connection between them. She'd tell him she'd never felt this way about anyone, that he understood her in ways no one else ever had. They'd make plans for the future, trips they'd take, places they'd live someday, dreams they'd build together. For those 3 months, David existed in this bubble of intensity and passion. Everything felt heightened, more colorful, more meaningful. He was happy, truly happy, but it was the kind of happiness that required Isabella's constant presence to maintain. He'd become like someone who needed their next fix, except his drug was her voice, her presence, the way she made the world feel possible. He didn't see the warning signs yet. Didn't recognize that healthy love shouldn't feel this consuming, this necessary for basic functioning. He just knew that Isabella had walked into his life and turned everything upside down, and he never wanted things to go back to how they were before. Around the 4-month mark, David started noticing things he'd been too caught up to see before. Small things at first, easy to dismiss or rationalize. Isabella would sometimes go quiet for a day or two, not responding to messages, seemingly vanishing from existence. The first time it happened, David panicked. He called repeatedly, imagined worst-case scenarios, barely slept. When she finally responded, she apologized and explained she'd needed some space, that sometimes she just had to disconnect. He told himself he understood, that everyone needed space sometimes. But it kept happening. The pattern became familiar, intense togetherness followed by sudden distance. During those disappearing acts, David would spiral. He'd analyze their last conversation, wondering if he'd said something wrong. He'd check his phone obsessively, seeing if she'd viewed his messages. His productivity at work would drop completely as he spent hours mentally replaying everything, trying to figure out what had changed. When Isabella would come back, she'd act like nothing had happened. She'd be affectionate again, want to spend time together, and David would feel such relief that he'd never bring up how her absence had affected him. He was afraid that questioning her would push her away permanently. So he stayed quiet, accepting this cycle of closeness and distance. Their arguments started around this time too. Isabella's passion, which he'd initially found so attractive, could flip to anger quickly. A minor disagreement about where to eat dinner could escalate into a full-blown fight about deeper issues: commitment, trust, his supposed lack of understanding about her needs. These fights were explosive, leaving David emotionally drained and confused about how they'd gotten there. But what messed with his head the most was how the fights would end. Isabella would apologize, explain that her emotions sometimes overwhelmed her, and then they'd reconnect in ways that felt even more intense than before. The making up became almost addictive in itself. The relief, the passion, the feeling that they'd overcome something together. David started unconsciously craving that cycle, even though the fights themselves were painful. His friends started pulling back. They'd gotten tired of making plans that David would cancel last minute if Isabella needed him. One of his closest friends, Thomas, tried having a serious conversation with him about it. Thomas said David had changed, that he seemed anxious all the time, that this relationship didn't look healthy from the outside. David got defensive. He accused Thomas of not understanding, of being jealous that he'd found something real. The conversation ended badly, and David stopped reaching out to Thomas after that. It was easier to be with Isabella, who understood him, than to deal with friends who questioned their relationship. His sister Rachel tried too. She invited him to family dinner one Sunday, and David brought Isabella along. The evening started fine, but Isabella got into a disagreement with Rachel about something political. What should have been a simple difference of opinion became heated, with Isabella getting visibly upset and David rushing to defend her. They left early, and Rachel texted him later saying she was worried about him, that he seemed like a different person. David ignored the message. Everyone was being too judgmental, he thought. They didn't see what he and Isabella had when they were good together. They didn't understand the depth of their connection. But alone, in moments he tried to avoid, David knew something was off. He'd started walking on eggshells around Isabella, trying to predict her moods, adjusting his behavior to keep things stable. If she seemed down, he'd exhaust himself trying to cheer her up, taking responsibility for her happiness. If she was in a good mood, he'd be extra careful not to do anything that might change that. He realized he'd stopped having opinions about things. Where they went, what they did, how they spent their time, he'd default to whatever Isabella wanted. It wasn't that she demanded this. It was that he'd learned that going along with her desires kept the peace, kept her happy, kept her close. The depression she'd mentioned early on became more visible. There were days when Isabella wouldn't get out of bed, when the world felt too heavy for her to face. David would take care of her during these episodes, bringing her food, sitting with her in silence, trying to will away her sadness through sheer presence. He felt helpless watching her struggle, but also needed, like he had a purpose. What he didn't recognize was that he was losing himself. His own needs, desires, and boundaries had dissolved. He'd stopped going to the gym, something he used to enjoy. He'd abandoned his hobby of sketching in his free time. He rarely saw anyone but Isabella. His whole life had narrowed to one person, and everything depended on whether she was close or distant, happy or sad, present or disappeared. His work situation got serious when his business partner, Kevin, sat him down for a difficult conversation. Projects were behind schedule. Client complaints had come in about David's lack of attention to detail. Kevin said he was concerned, not just as a business partner but as a friend. David promised to do better, but even as he said it, his phone buzzed with a text from Isabella, and his attention split immediately. The scary part was that David knew all of this, but felt powerless to change it. The thought of losing Isabella felt unbearable, like it would break something fundamental inside him. He'd rather deal with the chaos, the uncertainty, the emotional exhaustion than face the emptiness he imagined would come if she left. He'd become addicted not just to her, but to the entire cycle, the highs and lows, the drama and reconciliation, the intensity that made everything else feel pale in comparison. Normal life, stable relationships, predictable days, they all seemed boring now, meaningless without that edge of uncertainty that kept his heart racing. Late at night, lying beside a sleeping Isabella, David would sometimes look at her and feel this mixture of love and fear so intense it was almost painful. He loved her, truly loved her, but he was also terrified of her. Terrified of her leaving, terrified of her staying, terrified of what he was becoming in this relationship. But morning would come. Isabella would wake up and smile at him, and all those nighttime realizations would fade. He'd convince himself that every relationship had difficulties, that love was supposed to be intense and challenging. He'd ignore the voice in his head saying this wasn't normal, that he'd lost control of his own life. The cracks were showing, but David kept plastering over them, refusing to acknowledge that the foundation of this relationship might be built on something unstable. He was too deep in to see clearly, too addicted to the feeling she gave him to recognize that he was drowning. February came in cold and gray, matching David's growing sense of dread. Things had been relatively stable for a few weeks. No major fights, no disappearing acts. He'd started to hope that maybe they'd turned a corner, that the rough patches were behind them. He should have known better. They were having dinner at his apartment, something he'd cooked to surprise her. Isabella had been quiet all evening, pushing food around her plate without really eating. David tried making conversation, but everything he said seemed to fall flat. Finally, he asked what was wrong. Isabella put down her fork and looked at him with eyes that already seemed distant. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking. Those words sent ice through David's chest. Nothing good ever started with someone saying they'd been thinking. She told him she'd been offered an opportunity to travel through Southeast Asia, photographing communities and documenting stories. It was a project she'd been trying to get for years, fully funded, potentially life-changing for her career. She'd be gone for at least 6 months, maybe longer, and she wanted to go alone. David felt the floor drop out from under him. 6 months? Maybe longer? His mind immediately jumped to solutions. He could take time off, join her for parts of the trip, they could make it work. But Isabella stopped him before he could voice any of these ideas. She said this wasn't just about the trip. She'd been feeling suffocated lately, like she was losing herself in their relationship. She needed space to figure out who she was outside of them. Outside of any relationship. She cared about him deeply, maybe even loved him, but she wasn't ready to be tied down. She was only 28, and she felt like she was living a life that was too settled, too conventional for who she really was. David felt panic rising in his chest. He asked if this was about something he'd done, if he could fix it somehow. Isabella shook her head, saying it wasn't about him at all. It was about her needing to find herself, to be alone, to not depend on anyone else for her happiness. The conversation went in circles for hours. David alternated between trying to be understanding and supportive, then breaking down and begging her to reconsider. He told her he loved her, that they could work through this, that relationships required effort and commitment. He promised to give her more space while she was here, to be less needy, to be better, but Isabella had made up her mind. She was leaving in 2 weeks. She suggested they end things now, cleanly rather than trying to maintain something long distance that would just make everything harder. She said she cared about him too much to string him along when she knew she wasn't ready to be what he needed. David felt like he was dying. Not metaphorically. His chest actually hurt, his hands were shaking, he could barely breathe. The woman who had become his entire world was leaving, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He'd given her everything, rearranged his entire life around her, and it wasn't enough. After Isabella left that night, David fell apart. He called in sick to work for the rest of the week. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything. His apartment felt haunted by memories of her. The couch where they'd spent countless evenings, the kitchen where they'd cooked together, the bed they'd shared. Everything reminded him of what he was losing. His sister Rachel came over when he stopped responding to messages. She found him in a state she'd never seen before, unwashed, unshaven, barely functional. She tried to comfort him, but what could she say? She'd warned him this might happen, but being right didn't make it easier for either of them. The 2 weeks before Isabella left were torture. She reached out a few times wanting to meet up, to end things on good terms. David agreed, hoping each meeting might change her mind. But every conversation ended the same way, with Isabella firm in her decision and David more broken than before. He tried everything. He wrote her long messages about all their good memories, about the connection they shared, about the future they could have. He showed up at her apartment with flowers. He promised to change, to be whatever she needed. Looking back, he'd realize how desperate and unhealthy this all was, but in the moment he couldn't stop himself. The night before she left, they met one last time. Isabella was kind but distant, already mentally gone even though she stood right in front of him. She hugged him goodbye and David held on too long. Knowing it was the last time he'd hold her, she pulled away gently, told him to take care of himself, and then she was gone. The months that followed were the darkest of David's life. He went through the motions of existing, showed up to work, attended meetings, reviewed designs, but he wasn't really present. His mind was always elsewhere, replaying memories, imagining where Isabella was and what she was doing, wondering if she ever thought about him. He stalked her social media constantly. even though each post was like a knife to his chest. Pictures of her smiling in exotic locations, clearly thriving without him. She looked free, happy, exactly what she'd wanted, and David felt like he was drowning. His work suffered catastrophically. Kevin, his business partner, finally gave him an ultimatum: get help or they'd have to discuss dissolving the partnership. That shock, the realization that he was about to lose his business too, finally pushed David to do something he should have done months ago. He found a therapist, Dr. Patricia Coleman, who specialized in relationship issues and codependency. That first session was brutal. David tried to explain his relationship with Isabella, and even as he described it out loud, he started hearing how unhealthy it all sounded. The constant anxiety, the loss of self, the way his happiness had become entirely dependent on another person. Dr. Coleman introduced him to the concept of relationship addiction. She explained how some people become addicted to the neurochemical rush of intense, unstable relationships, the highs feeling like euphoria, the lows creating desperate need, the whole cycle mimicking substance addiction. David had never thought of it that way, but it fit perfectly. She helped him see patterns he'd missed, how he'd abandoned his own identity, how he'd made Isabella responsible for his emotional well-being, how the intensity he'd mistaken for deep love was actually a symptom of unhealthy attachment. It was hard to hear, painful to acknowledge, but also somehow relieving. It meant this wasn't just about Isabella leaving. It was about deeper issues he needed to address. The therapy wasn't a quick fix. David spent months working through his feelings, understanding why he'd been so vulnerable to this kind of relationship. They explored his childhood, his previous relationships, his fear of abandonment. Slowly, painfully, he started to rebuild himself. The first year after Isabella left was brutal, but somewhere in that darkness, David started finding himself again. Not the person he'd been before meeting her, but someone new, someone who'd been broken down and was slowly rebuilding with better materials. Therapy became his anchor. Dr. Coleman helped him understand that the emptiness he'd felt before Isabella wasn't something another person could fill. He'd been looking for someone to make him feel alive because he'd stopped doing that for himself. Isabella had been a temporary solution to a permanent problem, his disconnection from his own life. David started small. He began going to the gym again, not because he felt motivated, but because Dr. Coleman suggested structure and physical activity would help. Those early morning workouts were terrible. His body hurt. His mind wandered to Isabella constantly, but he kept showing up. Eventually, the exercise started helping. The physical exhaustion gave him breaks from the mental anguish. He reached out to Thomas, the friend he'd pushed away. It was an awkward conversation at first. David apologizing for his behavior, Thomas being cautiously receptive. They met for coffee, and David was honest about everything. Thomas didn't say, "I told you so," which David appreciated. Instead, he just said he was glad to have his friend back. Slowly, David rebuilt his social connections. He started saying yes to invitations again, forcing himself to show up even when he wanted to stay home and wallow. Those first few social gatherings were hard. He'd catch himself thinking about what Isabella would say about something, or wishing she was there to experience it with him. But gradually those thoughts became less frequent. His work life stabilized. With therapy helping him process his emotions, David could focus again. He threw himself into a major project, not as an escape this time, but because he genuinely wanted to create something meaningful. His business partner Kevin noticed the change, commenting that it was good to have the old David back. But David knew he wasn't the old version. He was building a better one. He picked up sketching again, something he'd abandoned completely during his time with Isabella. At first, his drawings were dark, processing his pain through art. But over time, they became lighter, more hopeful. He'd sketch at coffee shops and parks wherever inspiration struck. It reminded him that he could create and feel fulfilled without needing someone else there to validate it. David also started rock climbing, something completely new. A coworker invited him to an indoor climbing gym, and despite his initial hesitation, he went. There was something therapeutic about it. The physical challenge, the need for complete focus, the satisfaction of reaching the top of a route. Climbing became a metaphor for his recovery. Slow progress, occasional setbacks, but steady movement upward. About 8 months after Isabella left, David made a decision that terrified him. He booked a solo trip to Japan, something he'd always wanted to do. The old David would have needed someone with him. The David who'd been with Isabella would have wanted her there to experience it. But this new version decided to go alone, to prove to himself that he could find joy independently. That trip changed something fundamental. Walking through temples in Kyoto, getting lost in Tokyo's neighborhoods, sitting alone in small restaurants trying foods he couldn't pronounce, David discovered he enjoyed his own company. He took photographs not to post online or show anyone, but just to capture moments for himself. He had profound experiences that were his alone, not needing anyone to share them with to make them real. He also started dating again, though cautiously. The first few dates were awkward. He'd catch himself comparing women to Isabella, looking for that same intensity. But Dr. Coleman had helped him understand that intensity wasn't the same as compatibility, that the fireworks feeling he'd had with Isabella was partly his nervous system responding to instability, not necessarily deep love. He went on dates with women who were kind, stable, emotionally available. At first, these connections felt boring compared to what he'd had with Isabella. But he stuck with it, learning to appreciate qualities like consistency, mutual respect, and healthy communication. He learned that real intimacy could be quiet, that security wasn't the same as boredom. Then, about 11 months after Isabella had left, she reached out. Just a simple text saying she was back in town and asking if he wanted to meet for coffee. David stared at that message for a long time, feeling his heart rate spike. A year ago, even 6 months ago, he would have jumped at the chance immediately. But now he sat with the feeling. He noticed the anxiety that came up, the old patterns trying to reassert themselves. He talked about it with Dr. Coleman, who reminded him that he didn't owe Isabella anything. That meeting her should be his choice, not something driven by old addictions. After a few days, David agreed to meet her, not because he hoped to get back together, but because he was curious to see her with his new perspective, to test how far he'd come. They met at the same diner where they'd had their first long conversation, which felt both nostalgic and significant. Isabella looked good, tanned, healthy, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who'd done exactly what she needed to do. She talked about her travels, the photographs she'd taken, the people she'd met. David listened, genuinely interested, but he noticed he wasn't hanging on every word like he used to. Then Isabella turned the conversation to them. She said she'd missed him, that she'd thought about him often during her travels. She'd grown a lot, figured out what she wanted from life. She wondered if maybe they could try again, with both of them in better places now. David felt the pull of old patterns, the temptation to say yes to the familiarity, the comfort of falling back into something known. But then he took a breath and really looked at Isabella. He saw her clearly for the first time. Beautiful, talented, complicated, but also someone who hadn't fundamentally changed. She was still searching for something external to complete her, still moving from place to place and relationship to relationship looking for an answer. He realized something crucial. Isabella had taught him an important lesson, but she wasn't meant to be his future. She'd been a storm that tore apart his carefully controlled life, forcing him to confront parts of himself he'd been avoiding. That destruction had been necessary, but it didn't mean he should rebuild on the same foundation. David told her gently that he appreciated what they'd had, that she'd changed his life in ways he'd needed. But he'd also learned that the intensity they'd shared wasn't sustainable or healthy. He'd spent the last year learning to find passion and meaning in his own life, without needing someone else to provide it. He wished her the best, truly hoped she found what she was looking for, but he needed to continue moving forward on his own path. Isabella looked surprised, maybe even a little hurt. She'd probably expected him to still be waiting for her, but she respected his decision. They finished their coffee, shared a hug that felt like closure, and parted ways. Walking back to his car, David felt something unexpected. Peace. Not the dramatic relief of escaping something terrible, but the quiet satisfaction of making a healthy choice for himself. He didn't feel triumphant or bitter. He just felt okay, like he was exactly where he needed to be. The months that followed continued his steady growth. David kept going to therapy, kept building his friendships, kept pursuing activities that brought him genuine joy. He even started teaching an introductory architecture class at a local community college, discovering he loved sharing his knowledge with others. He met someone new eventually, Victoria, a landscape architect he connected with through work. Their relationship was different from what he'd had with Isabella. It was calmer, steadier, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than intense highs and lows. At first, David worried it was too calm, that maybe he wasn't feeling enough. But Dr. Coleman helped him understand that this was what healthy love felt like: secure, consistent, peaceful. 2 years after Isabella had first walked into his life, David found himself standing in front of his own photography exhibit. He'd started taking photos during his recovery, capturing architecture in ways that showed emotion and humanity. It wasn't professional like Isabella's work, but it was his, an expression of how far he'd come. Rachel attended the opening, proud of her brother's transformation. Thomas was there too, along with other friends David had reconnected with. Victoria stood beside him, supportive but not overshadowing, letting this moment be his. Standing in that gallery, David reflected on everything that had happened. Isabella had been like a storm, devastating but also cleansing. She'd torn through his carefully constructed life, destroying his illusions about himself and what he needed. That destruction had hurt terribly, had nearly broken him completely. But from that breaking had come something better. He'd learned that another person couldn't complete him, that real happiness came from within. He'd learned the difference between intensity and intimacy, between addiction and love. He'd learned that surviving chaos didn't mean he had to keep living in it. Isabella had taught him to feel deeply, to take risks, to live fully. But the most important lesson came after she left, that he could hold on to those qualities without needing chaos to access them. He could be passionate about his own life, take risks on his own terms, feel deeply without losing himself in another person.